My name is Danielle Carter, and I was 22 years old when I made some of the worst decisions of my life. At the time, I thought they were acts of love. Looking back now, at 34, with more scars and a lot more wisdom, I can finally admit they were acts of fear. Fear of being alone, fear of starting over, fear of losing a future I'd already built in my head. And all of it started with a man named Ethan Parker. I met Ethan when I was 20. He was 19. We met at a friend's house party on a humid summer night outside Minneapolis. The music was too loud inside, so we ended up sitting on the back porch talking for hours while everyone else drank and laughed. I remember the way he made me feel, like I was the only person in the world worth listening to. Every story I told seemed fascinating to him. Every joke earned a genuine laugh. By the time I drove home that night, I couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in my life, I believed I'd met the person I was supposed to spend forever with. Young people are incredibly confident about things they know absolutely nothing about. Love is usually at the top of that list. For nearly 2 years, things felt perfect, or at least perfect enough. Ethan lived with his mother, Linda. I lived with mine. We both worked. We both saved money. We spent weekends driving through neighborhoods, imagining apartments we couldn't yet afford. We talked about furniture, future vacations, pets, wedding ideas, the kind of conversations people have when they assume forever is guaranteed. My mother liked him. That mattered to me. She was usually a good judge of character. Sometimes I wonder if she saw the warning signs long before I did and simply hoped I'd figure them out myself. Then Ethan got a second job, an evening shift at a convenience store. He said he wanted to save faster so we could finally move in together. I admired his ambition. I was working long hours myself and trying to build a future. At first, everything seemed normal. Then little things started changing. The changes weren't dramatic. They were subtle, almost invisible. Until they weren't, he stopped laughing as much when we were together. He canceled plans more often. His phone suddenly became glued to his hand. When messages appeared, he would flip the screen over. When I asked what was wrong, he always had an explanation. I'm tired. Work's been crazy. You're overthinking. Maybe I wanted to believe him. Maybe believing him felt safer than facing the alternative. One night, he told me he was covering an extra shift. A few hours later, I drove past an apartment complex on the other side of town and saw his car parked outside, nowhere near the convenience store. I remember gripping the steering wheel. My stomach twisted, but I kept driving. I convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. People in love become experts at explaining away evidence. A few weeks later, Ethan casually mentioned a coworker, a woman named Megan Collins. Megan lives near me, he said one evening. I give her rides home sometimes. Nothing unusual about that. At least that's what I told myself. My best friend Ryan wasn't convinced. He raised an eyebrow. Maybe keep an eye on that. I laughed it off. A month later, the truth began finding me. The first person was one of Ethan's coworkers, a young woman named Jessica. She pulled me aside during a gathering and looked genuinely uncomfortable. I think you deserve to know something. Those words instantly made my chest tighten. She told me Ethan and Megan weren't just coworkers anymore. They were spending nights together at Megan's apartment, multiple times a week. I thanked her. Then I went home. I sat in my car in the driveway for nearly half an hour, staring through the windshield. Part of me already knew. The signs had been there. I just hadn't wanted to read them. But I still didn't confront him. I still didn't tell Ryan. I carried the secret alone. 2 days later, Ethan's closest friend called me. Her name was Kimberly, and everything changed. Kimberly sounded nervous on the phone. The kind of nervous that comes from knowing you're about to change someone's life. Danielle, I've gone back and forth about calling you. My heart sank, because deep down, I already knew what she was about to say. Ethan and Megan have been seeing each other for months. Silence filled my truck. I couldn't even find words. Kimberly continued carefully. She told me she'd confronted Ethan herself, told him what he was doing was wrong. told him he couldn't keep living two separate relationships and pretend they didn't affect each other. According to her, Ethan had brushed it off, claimed what he had with Megan was completely separate from what he had with me. Separate. As if betrayal could be neatly organized into different compartments. As if lies somehow hurt less when labeled. After hanging up, I sat there for nearly an hour. The pieces finally fit together. The canceled plans, the hidden phone, the late nights, the apartment, Megan, all of it. That night, I confronted him. I expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even honesty. Instead, Ethan cried. Real tears. Or at least convincing ones. He wrapped his arms around me and insisted everyone was lying. Jessica was jealous. Kimberly was overreacting. Megan was just a coworker. Nothing more. I wanted to believe him. More accurately, I needed to believe him. Because accepting the truth meant accepting that the future I'd imagined was collapsing, and I wasn't ready for that. So I chose denial. I chose comfort. I chose the lie. 12 years later, that's still one of the hardest things for me to admit. The evidence was right in front of me, and I looked away. About a month later, I agreed to attend a professional training conference with several coworkers. It was only a few days. A chance to learn new techniques and get away from the stress that had consumed my life. Ryan encouraged me to go. You need space, he said. Maybe he was right. Ethan wasn't happy about the trip. He never outright said not to go. Instead, he used the same passive-aggressive tactics he'd perfected over time. Short texts, delayed responses, cold conversations, tiny punishments. I went anyway. And while I was there, I made a mistake. One that I'm not proud of. One that still bothers me. One night after a conference event, overwhelmed by confusion, hurt, and resentment, I crossed a line with someone I met there. It lasted only a few hours. The guilt lasted much longer. Almost immediately afterward, I felt sick. Not because Ethan deserved loyalty after everything he'd done, but because I deserved better than becoming someone I didn't recognize. For the rest of the trip, I barely slept. Every message from Ethan made my stomach twist. Ryan noticed something was wrong when I got home. I didn't tell him. I didn't tell anyone. Instead, I did something even more irrational. Something so foolish that I still cringe when I think about it. I bought an engagement ring. A beautiful diamond ring. $1,800. Almost every dollar I'd saved through overtime. Looking back, it felt like watching someone run toward a burning building carrying gasoline. Ryan nearly lost his mind when he found out. You bought a ring. I nodded. Daniel. Tell me you're joking. I'm not. He stared at me, completely speechless. Finally, he rubbed his face. You're proposing to a man you know is cheating on you because you feel guilty for one mistake. When you say it like that, because that's exactly what it is. I heard every word. I just wasn't ready to listen. A week later, I proposed. Ethan cried. I cried. We hugged. We promised each other new beginnings, fresh starts, second chances. For a brief moment, I truly believed love had conquered everything. The reality was far less romantic. The engagement lasted 18 months. And during those 18 months, Ethan broke up with me 4 separate times. Each breakup followed the exact same pattern. Something minor happened. He exploded it into a crisis. He ended the relationship. Then he came back a few days later, expecting forgiveness. The first breakup happened because of laundry. Seriously. His clothes came out slightly damp after using my mother's dryer. Not ruined. Not damaged. Just slightly damp. He stormed out. Then texted me an hour later. I don't think this relationship is working. I was devastated. Ryan was not. He dumped you over laundry. It wasn't just laundry. Daniel. It was absolutely laundry. 2 days later, Ethan called, acted like nothing happened, and I took him back. The second breakup happened because I didn't respond to a text quickly enough. I was busy at work. My phone wasn't nearby. 3 hours later, I checked it and found 6 increasingly angry messages. By the time I called him back, he'd already decided we were finished. 2 days later, he returned. Again. The third breakup happened because of dinner plans that existed only inside Ethan's head. Apparently, he expected us to go out that Saturday night. He never told me. I made plans with Ryan. Somehow, that became proof I didn't prioritize him. Another breakup. Another reconciliation. By then, the pattern felt disturbingly normal. That was the most dangerous part. Toxicity becomes easier to tolerate when it's familiar. You stop questioning behavior that should alarm you. You adapt. You survive. You settle. Then came Valentine's Day. The fourth breakup. The final one. I was attending a training event in another state. That evening, I called Ethan from my hotel room. I thought we could make plans for when I returned. Maybe dinner. Maybe a movie. Something simple. Instead, I heard 4 words. We need to talk. The same words. The same tone. The same script? Immediately, I knew what was coming. He told me he needed space, said he wasn't sure engagement was what he wanted, claimed he needed time to figure himself out. The usual vague excuses. But something inside me had finally changed. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Exhaustion. Pure exhaustion. Years of manipulation. Years of uncertainty. Years of chasing someone who always seemed halfway out the door. I suddenly realized I couldn't do it anymore. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then, I quietly said, "Okay." The silence on the other end was immediate. Confused. Uneasy. As if he'd expected a completely different response. "That's it?" he asked. I stared out the hotel window. Snow drifted through the parking lot below. For the first time in years, I felt strangely calm. "When I get home," I said, "bring back the ring and pick up your things." Another long silence. "Danielle." "No." My voice stayed steady. "Bring back the ring. Take your things. We're done." For the first time since we'd met, Ethan had no script, no emotional leverage, no apology that could rewind the moment. The cycle had finally broken, and neither of us knew what would happen next. 3 days later, Ethan arrived at my mother's house, but he didn't come alone. And what happened next was something so absurd that even now, 12 years later, it still sounds unbelievable. 3 days later, Ethan showed up exactly when he said he would. I had everything prepared. Every trace of him that remained in my life sat neatly packed beside the front door. A grocery bag, a small box, a few shirts, some shoes, a hairdryer, toiletries, random odds and ends he left behind during 2 years of dating. That was it. 2 years together. En engagement, countless promises. And somehow his entire physical presence in my life fit inside a grocery bag. That should have been a warning all by itself. Some relationships take up your whole heart while leaving almost no footprint behind. The moment I opened the door, I realized Ethan hadn't come alone. Standing beside him was his mother, Linda. I wasn't surprised. If Ethan needed emotional backup, Linda was always available. She treated her son less like an adult and more like a misunderstood prince who deserved special treatment from the world. Whatever Ethan wanted, Linda supported. Whatever Ethan felt, Linda validated. Together, they were dangerous in a strangely ordinary way. Not loud, not aggressive, just endlessly convinced they were right. I handed Ethan the bag and box. He placed them on the floor, without a word. He slipped the engagement ring off his finger and handed it back. For a brief moment, I thought maybe we'd handle this like adults. Maybe we'd exchange belongings, wish each other well, move on. I should have known better. Ethan slowly looked around my mother's living room. The television, the bookshelf, the coffee table, the lamps. His eyes lingered on everything. Then he said something so ridiculous that my brain needed a second to process it. "Shouldn't I get more?" I blinked. "What?" He crossed his arms. "We were engaged." I stared at him, and his voice became defensive. "I put years into this relationship. I think I deserve something." For a moment, I honestly wondered if this was some kind of joke. Then Linda stepped forward. "He's right." I looked at her. She nodded confidently. 2 years together is a serious investment, Investment. The word nearly made me laugh. As though dating me had been a business venture. As though Ethan had purchased stock in my future. I glanced around the room. My mother's furniture isn't an investment return. Linda ignored that. Instead, she started walking around the living room, pointing at my mother's belongings. That television, the bookshelf, the coffee machine. Every sentence sounded more absurd than the last. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Neither of them had ever lived there. Neither of them had ever paid a bill there. Neither of them had contributed a single dollar toward anything inside that house. Yet somehow they were discussing division of property, like we were ending a 20-year marriage, like there were shared assets, like reality had stopped applying. Ethan, I said carefully. You've never lived here? He shrugged. That doesn't change the fact that I invested years into us. I laughed. A real laugh. The kind you can't stop. Because if you don't laugh, you'll lose your mind. You broke up with me 4 times. His expression hardened. That's not the point. No? Actually, it is. Linda immediately jumped in. Relationships aren't always perfect. Neither is trying to take my mother's coffee maker. That finally made her frown. It's not about the coffee maker. Then, why do you keep pointing at it? For a second. Neither answered. The silence almost made me smile. Then, Ethan switched tactics. His eyes softened. His voice grew emotional. I recognized the performance instantly. The same one he'd used every time he wanted forgiveness. I just feel like after everything we've been through, I should leave with something. I looked at the grocery bag. You're leaving with everything that belongs to you. What about the ring? I held it up. What about it? It was mine. I couldn't believe this conversation was real. No. It was yours while we were engaged. Linda folded her arms. That's unfair. I stared at her. Unfair. The word echoed through my head. Unfair. Not the cheating. Not the manipulation. Not 4 breakups. Not ending our engagement on Valentine's Day. No. Apparently the unfair part was not receiving furniture from a house they didn't own. The audacity was almost impressive. Linda pointed at a framed photograph sitting on a shelf. A picture of my mother and me from years earlier. What about that? I looked at the frame, then at hair, then back at the frame. For several seconds I genuinely couldn't find words. She wanted a family photograph. Not because it had value, not because it belonged to Ethan, simply because it existed. And somehow, in her mind, that made it negotiable. That was the moment something inside me finally settled. For years I'd been confused. For years I'd tried understanding Ethan, tried fixing problems, tried making sense of irrational behavior. Suddenly I understood everything. There was nothing to fix. No misunderstanding. No hidden explanation. This was who they were. People who viewed relationships as transactions. People who believed proximity created ownership. People who thought time invested entitled them to rewards. And for the first time, I felt absolutely nothing. No guilt. No sadness. No longing. Only clarity. I walked to the front door, opened it, and held it there. We're done. Linda's jaw tightened. Danielle, no. I pointed outside. Take your things and leave. Ethan didn't move immediately. Instead, he gave me a look I'd seen countless times before. The wounded expression. The one designed to make me chase him. To make me apologize. To make me reconsider. The look that had worked every other time. But something had changed. The hook was gone. There was nothing left for him to pull. After several seconds, he finally picked up the bag. Linda grabbed the box. Neither looked happy. Neither looked victorious. For the first time, they looked confused. As though they couldn't understand why the old tricks weren't working anymore. Before Ethan stepped outside, I quietly said, "Good luck." He hesitated. I met his eyes. "You're going to need it." Something flickered across his face. Regret. Anger. Embarrassment. Maybe all 3. Then he turned around and walked away. The car disappeared down the street. And just like that, it was over. When my mother came home later, I told her everything. The television. The lamp. the coffee maker, the family photo. She listened silently. Then she looked around her living room, slowly, carefully. Finally, she shook her head. He wanted my lamp. I nodded. She stared at it for another second, then laughed so hard she nearly had to sit down. That night was the first peaceful night I'd had in years. But the story wasn't over, because 12 years later, when I was happily married and living a completely different life, a voice in a grocery store would bring every memory rushing back, and the man standing there would be almost unrecognizable. 12 years passed. 12 years that felt both impossibly long and strangely short. Life has a way of doing that. The moments that once seemed world-ending eventually become stories you tell over dinner. Scars become lessons. Heartbreak becomes perspective. And people who once occupied every corner of your mind slowly fade into strangers. By 34, my life looked nothing like the one I imagined at 22. And thank God for that. I was married to an incredible man named Daniel Walker. We'd been together 7 years. Married for 4. We owned a comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood. I had built a successful career. Daniel loved me in ways I didn't even know were possible when I was younger. There were no games, no breakups, no emotional traps, no constant fear that one wrong move would make everything collapse. Just trust, consistency, peace. It took me years to realize how valuable peace actually is. When you're young, you mistake drama for passion. You mistake chaos for love. Then you grow up and realize healthy love is supposed to feel safe. One Saturday morning, I was doing grocery shopping. Nothing unusual. Daniel had given me a list. I was methodically working my way through the store when I heard someone say my name, Daniel. The voice stopped me cold. Not because I recognized it immediately, because some voices stay buried in your memory forever. I turned around, and there was Ethan. For a second, neither of us spoke. 12 years vanished. Then reality returned. He looked older. Of course he did. So did I. But there was something else. A heaviness. A fatigue that seemed woven into his posture. The confident young man I'd once planned to marry was gone. Standing in front of me was someone who looked tired of carrying his own life. Beside him stood a little girl holding a juice box, maybe 5 years old. His daughter. She was quietly kicking the shopping cart while staring at cereal boxes. "Wow," Ethan said softly. "It's really you." I smiled politely. "Hi, Ethan." We exchanged the usual surface-level conversation. "How have you been? How's life? What are you doing now?" Nothing deep, nothing personal. Then he casually mentioned he was living with his mother again, going through a divorce. The words were simple, but the exhaustion behind them wasn't. I didn't ask questions, didn't need details, didn't want them. The past no longer had that kind of access to me. Then his eyes dropped to my left hand, to my wedding ring. His gaze stayed there a second too long. "You got married?" I smiled. 4 years ago. His expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but I saw it. The brief flash of regret, the quiet realization of roads not taken. "That's great," he said, but it didn't sound great. It sounded painful. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he asked something unexpected. "Do you ever think about us?" The question hung between us. The old Danielle would have panicked, would have searched for the perfect answer, would have worried about hurting his feelings. But that version of me no longer existed. Instead, I found myself thinking about the young woman I used to be. The woman who ignored warnings. The woman who confused sacrifice with love. The woman who bought an engagement ring because she was too afraid to walk away. I felt compassion for her. Not embarrassment. Not shame. Compassion. She had done her best with what she knew. And eventually she learned. I looked back at Ethan and answered honestly. "No." His eyes lowered slightly. Not dramatically, just enough. A tiny movement that said, "Everything." He nodded. "I understand." And for the first time in our lives, I think he actually did. We said goodbye a few minutes later. He pushed the cart away, his daughter chatting happily beside him. I watched them disappear around the corner. Then I stood there for a moment, Not sad. Not angry. Not nostalgic. Just grateful. Grateful for every mistake. Every lesson. Every red flag I eventually stopped ignoring. Because all of it led me somewhere better. When I got home, Daniel was helping unload groceries. I told him about the encounter, the entire story, the surprise, the conversation, the question. He listened quietly. Then he set down a bag of apples and smiled. Did he try to take half the cereal? I laughed so hard, I nearly dropped a carton of eggs. That was Daniel. Always finding the perfect thing to say. Always reminding me why I fell in love with him. Later that night, after dinner, I sat alone on the back patio for a while, thinking. Not about Ethan, not really. About lessons. About growth. About the strange paths that bring us where we're meant to be. For years, I'd thought Ethan broke my heart. But the truth was more complicated. He exposed weaknesses I needed to overcome. My fear of being alone. My lack of boundaries. My willingness to accept treatment I never should have tolerated. The relationship ended exactly when it needed to. Before marriage. Before mortgages. Before children. Before legal ties that would have made leaving infinitely harder. Sometimes, the greatest blessing arrives disguised as rejection. Sometimes losing the wrong person creates room for the right one. And sometimes, a man who points at your mother's lamp and claims partial ownership is actually doing you the biggest favor of your life. I don't hate Ethan. I haven't, for years. I genuinely hope he figures things out. I hope he becomes the kind of person who understands that love isn't ownership. That relationships aren't transactions. That people aren't investments. Maybe he already has. Maybe that's why he looked so tired. Maybe life finally taught him lessons that nobody else could. As for me, I went inside, locked the door, wrapped my arms around my husband, and smiled. Because my story didn't end with betrayal, it ended with wisdom. It ended with self-respect. It ended with peace. And peace, I've learned, is worth more than every engagement ring in the world.